I'm JG Michael, and this is Parallax Views. This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mersham, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mersham, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Welcome to Parallax Views. Two guests that I'm very, very excited to have on. One is catch historian and the man behind Scientific Wrestling and the show Shoot Pro Wrestling, Jake Shannon.
Yeah, hey, what's going on, guys?
And our next guest is a legend in UFC, a UFC Hall of Famer, the Croatian sensation, Pat Miletich. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me, JG.
And we've also just been joined by the King of Connecticut himself, Matt Granahan. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, man. It's great to be on. Pleasure to meet you.
So the first area I wanted to start out with, and maybe you could tackle this, Jake, is what is Shoot Pro Wrestling, and how is it part of something bigger? Scientific Wrestling, I think it's more than just a brand for you. I think it's a subculture, even a movement, an idea, something that wants to revive a great tradition, the tradition of catch-as-catch-can wrestling. Can you speak to that, Jake?
Yeah, man. I mean, I think you really actually got a great feel for it because I love the spirit of the question. And, it's funny because actually I was having a conversation with the King of Connecticut, and this was the other day. And we just came off of WrestleMania, right? And we know that the UFC and WrestleMania or WWE are now under the same ownership of Endeavor, under the control of Ari Emanuel, who is an interesting character. If anybody knows the old TV show on HBO Entourage, Ari, the character on that, was based on him. He's also brother to Rahm Emanuel, one of Obama's cronies from back in the day. So I tried to watch WrestleMania, and I'm going to be real, I could not really get into the product at all. And I was giving it a charitable view. And I found this to be the case as well with the newer version of the UFC. I'm not in love with the product, honestly. And I hearken back to the earlier days, guys like Pat Miletich, guys like Frank Shamrock, guys like Kazushi Sakuraba, where I just was more pulled into the product, and I was pulled in because it was not so overproduced and fake. I mean, I'm not saying UFC's fake. I mean, it's real competitors, but it's just so overproduced and polished and politicized now, and it's lost a lot of the appeal. So for me, the whole premise of scientific wrestling is, you nailed it. It was really a revival to bring back the beauty of this sport, which in my estimate, I've worked professionally as a statistician, so I'm happy to make this argument with anybody that wants to debate me, that catch as catch can is arguably the most impactful combat sport. And I would even argue to say sport that's ever lived when you look at, and I'm quantifying this, the number of fans, athletes, coaches, and promoters or business people associated with catch or its derivatives, that being professional wrestling, MMA, folk style wrestling here, or scholastic wrestling in the States, and Olympic wrestling. If you were to quantify, it's the most impactful thing. And it's crazy to me that nobody except maybe the people on this call and a handful of others really know that. And so the vision with Shoot Pro Wrestling is to take some of the, like professional wrestling until the 80s was a fraudulent activity. They presented something as real that is fake. Now, we might make some commentary that politics itself has become pro wrestling. A lot of it is fake, but nobody really appreciates that. And that was, I think a big point of contention in the 80s. Well, the term shoot in pro wrestling parlance means a legitimate contest. So in some ways, it's, to speak the language of these pro wrestling people, it's an invasion angle by the people who could really wrestle to co-opt and take back professional wrestling from the corruption and the bullshit, frankly. So Shoot Pro Wrestling is the tip of the spear, and the body of the spear is scientific wrestling. I don't want to go on and on about it, but I don't know if that answers the question.
No, I totally get that. And I wanted to ask Matt how he became involved with what you're doing. And maybe, Matt, you're very good at promoting this kind of thing. What do you want to say to folks out there that may just be pro wrestling fans, or they may just be fans of UFC? Why should they get into scientific wrestling and Shoot Pro Wrestling?
Well, I'll tell you, what's old is new here, and we're taking fans back to the future with Shoot Pro Wrestling. There's a great movie that came out recently called Queen of the Ring, and it's based on a book about Mildred Burke, and it goes back to the Carney days of Take On All Comers, where Mildred came out of the carnivals. And I have a unique experience in my own life coming from the amateur wrestling mat to meet an old timer named Billy Wicks, who I just kind of stumbled across when I was involved with the grappling, and he became like a second father to me. And he introduced me to a gentleman named Frankie Kane, who was the great Mephisto. And I really got interested decades ago in learning this history. And that's where I met Jake. Actually, Jake, I have to give major kudos and thanks to, because it was Jake actually who put me in touch with Eric Paulson years ago. And I was in a unique position at that time because I was on a severance from my job and was competing in the grappling and having a little cup of coffee, competing in the MMA and cornering some fights at that time. And Jake had me go out and meet Eric, and we did a book together, which really got me submerged in this history, a book called Rough and Tumble, the history of American submission wrestling that chronicled this history. And I was also doing pro wrestling. I started doing pro wrestling when I was in college. I was wrestling and doing judo, and a guy at my judo school was getting into the pro wrestling, and I loved it. I always loved pro wrestling, and that's how I got into it. But I was never formally trained as a professional wrestler. I learned from doing matches with him before the internet became so popularized, where we could kind of do the same thing night in and night out and perfect our match. And it was a lot of wrestling. And that's how I was able to bring guys from the MMA world, MMA cage, dear friends of mine like Phil Baroni and the late Stephan Bonner, into professional wrestling, to have very realistic matches where we went out there and we wrestled. And Shoot Pro is really truly going back to the future and the origins of this sport, going back to the original Strangler, Evan Lewis, going back to Martin Farmer Burns, who's really truly the grandfather of American professional wrestling, going back to Frank Gotch and George Hackenschmidt, those days. And like I say, what's old is new, and what's so exciting and what should really resonate with the fans when they hear about Shoot Pro Wrestling is this team we've assembled. No one else in the combat sports world has a team like ours. And I believed in the brand so much that I leveraged my relationships with Gerald Briscoe, who I met actually through recruiting a young man that I had coached in amateur wrestling. Because he used to go out, he was a stud wrestler himself. He and his brother from Oklahoma State Cowboys, and went into pro wrestling. And he used to go out and recruit from the amateur ranks. And I had a young man, Tim Dudley, that I had coached that went on to Nebraska, and he was kind of like a Rock type of a character. He was second in the nation in amateur wrestling, only a couple points away, and then had a great match at Midlands against Dave Taylor and really got his name out there. And he also wanted to recruit Phil Baroni, and we had Phil on the precipice of going in to the WWE too at that time. So I mean, Shoot Pro Wrestling is just the perfect place for me, because it's really what's old is new. And the team we've assembled, I mentioned Gerald Briscoe. I also brought Larry Zbyszko on board, the living legend, who was, prior to his pro wrestling career, came out of Pennsylvania and was a scholarship wrestler at Penn State, and then went on to have his feud with Bruno Sammartino. But also, Larry trained in hooks and in shooting with an old time British wrestler that Jake was familiar with, that was tight with Billy Robinson. And then we also brought in from Jake's side, Frank Shamrock. And I was able to introduce Jake to the awesome Croatian sensation, our president now of Shoot Pro, Pat Miletich. And I really want to give a shout out before his passing. I introduced Stephan Bonner to Jake, and we put together a great commercial with Stephan and Forrest Griffin. And Stephan was such a believer in the brand that he came up with a whole invasion angle that we were going to do. But he came up with a UFC invasion angle into Shoot Pro Wrestling. So really the roots of the sport for the fans, the true roots of not only professional wrestling, but also of mixed martial arts, are here at Shoot Pro Wrestling. An interesting fact that the fans should know, the Gracie family was actually trained by Count Koma, Mitsuyu Maeda, who was a competitive catch wrestler and judoka. And the Gracie family used to all run the carnivals in Brazil. And that's how they learned submissions. So the roots of the tree from MMA, from amateur wrestling to professional wrestling to grappling, are all the catch wrestling. And what we're doing is traditional catch wrestling, pin and submission, with athletes from the grappling stage, the amateur wrestling mat, and the grappling stage, the amateur wrestling mat, and the MMA cage. So it's really exciting what we have going on with Shoot Pro Wrestling. I urge everybody to check out shootprowrestling.com.
So I have a bit of a two-part question for Pat, if that's okay. And the first part of the question is, you're one of the original sort of hybrid stylists within American MMA. You're sort of dealing with all different types of disciplines. How foundational was the catch style of wrestling to your style of fighting?
Well, I mean, naturally, you know, having grown up wrestling in Iowa since kindergarten, first grade, you know, wrestling was my base for everything. Wrestling made me a great football player. Wrestling made me a great fighter. And just because I got a black belt in jiu-jitsu, which I have great respect for jiu-jitsu, it's an amazing art. But naturally, as a wrestler, my whole life, I'm going to take what makes sense to me from jiu-jitsu and incorporate that. I'm going to take what makes sense to me from even catch wrestling, the submission style of catch wrestling that they used primarily. I'm going to take what works in sambo, the leg locks and other things. So, you know, for me, it was everything. It was our style. We were technically catch wrestlers with really good Muay Thai and boxing skills. That's what we were.
What was it about wrestling that you think made you just better as an athlete? Was it more than just teaching you how to fight? Did it also do something for your mindset?
Well, there's no way to get through wrestling, especially in the state of Iowa or Pennsylvania or, you know, a lot of these other Midwest states and other places where there's really tough wrestlers. You don't get through a season and multiples of seasons without becoming tougher. And especially, you know, where I grew up in Bettendorf, Iowa at the time, that was the creme de la creme of even Iowa State wrestling, high school wrestling. Along with a couple other places like Lisbon and Des Moines Dowling and a couple other, you know, places that stand out. So the toughest kids you're ever going to run into are in your own room. I mean, our second and third stringers could go out and crush almost everyone, you know, around the country. So the work ethic, the explosiveness, the tendon strength, the you know, the endurance, there's just so many things that apply from wrestling. The reaction time, knowing where daylight is at all times, in scrambles, you know, all those different things, action and reactionary skills that nothing else is going to teach you. That you can wrestle at such breakneck speed once you get good enough that you're acting and reacting in microseconds, and that's just, most people are not capable of doing that.
You also sort of already hit upon the second part of the question I had for you, which was you mentioned Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which I also respect very much, like yourself. But sometimes I do think wrestling gets overlooked when it comes to MMA. And, you know, we hear a lot about BJJ, but not always as much about wrestling. And maybe that's changed a little bit in recent times, but sometimes I feel like catch is overlooked. Can you speak to that? Do you think catch wrestling has been overlooked when we look at the foundations of American MMA?
Well, I think people neglecting, you know, so the things that were going on in Brazil starting in 1921 with Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, well, that was going on here in America, right? That's just, I mean, the Midwest and the massive circuit of wrestlers. My great uncle during the Depression into the 30s would even go to carnivals and fairs, and the carnival strongmen back in those days were, you know, guys like the Terrible Turks and others that would challenge people in the crowd. And my uncle would go and, you know, hone his skills beating those guys up, you know, that sort of stuff. So, but I think that look, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu again, I would say this: the guy that originally taught me Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Sergio Monteiro, black belt from Rio de Janeiro. when he and I rolled for the first time, and I had for 1 year done nothing but technique of position to position to position stuff with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu stuff, tapes, just on videotapes. And I rolled with a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, and we went for an hour, and neither one of us submitted each other. And it was a 1 hour nonstop scramble. He looked at me and he said, "Where did you learn your skills?" And I said, "Videotapes." And he said, "What?" And I said, "Yeah, videotapes." And he couldn't believe it, but that was because of my wrestling, right? So there's no way that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu by itself would be able to attain the lofty goals that it has without wrestlers learning the submission game, right? And so a lot of Americans just weren't aware of, the Mr. Wicks, the Farmer Burns, the Gotch, all this history. They weren't even aware of American history. That's why we're doing what we're doing, to bring back that history so that people understand the level of monster that this creates.
And I should add, I said American MMA, but really, I mean, catch wrestling has a history going from Wigan with Billy Robinson to the carnivals in America, even to Japan. So the question I want to ask you, Matt, if you can, with this rich, wild history that catch wrestling has, what role do you see scientific wrestling and shoot pro wrestling playing in preserving or even rewriting that story, that rich history for a new generation?
Absolutely. And I think that Shoot Pro Wrestling is the perfect platform to do that. When I was in Vegas at CatchCon and we had the tournaments, we had folks from the amateur wrestling mat, from grappling, from MMA, all competing there. I was able to do a podcast with Frank Shamrock, and it's fantastic. I encourage you to listen to it because he came out of Pancras, and I don't know how many of your fans know how American MMA was spawned out of professional wrestling. I mentioned the pro wrestling and catch wrestling roots are the foundation of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but also organizations like Shuto. I talked about Eric Paulson, who I did my Rough and Tumble book with. Shuto predates UFC by 9 or 10 years. And then you had Pancras, which produced Ken and Frank Shamrock, Guy Metzger, Boss Rutan, on UFC champions. And that was spawned out of professional wrestling and out of UWFI. And Carl Gotch was really the instrumental character because it was Funaki and Suzuki, who were his students, who were the stars in Pancras. So what Frank, discussed in the interview was that it's basically all pro wrestling. And I've always said that about UFC. And Art Davey, who was the original founder of UFC, who's a dear friend of mine who I've done a number of podcasts with. He used to be a regular guest on my old show, King's Court. He used to say that UFC was really just a shoot pro wrestling promotion, just like Shuto, which was founded by Tiger Mask, had the roots with Carl Gotch, just like Pancras. And that's what we can really convey to the fans. And also, shoot pro wrestling is so fan friendly. It's so exciting. A lot of times people will watch grappling and it can be boring. In shoot pro, because we have the pin, it forces the action. And I've had the pleasure of calling these matches with Pat and with Jake and with Larry Zabisco. And I can tell you, they are fast action matches because you've got to get your blades off the mat. And in conjunction with showing fans how exciting shoot pro wrestling is, we can also show them the history. And through our programming with shoot pro wrestling, we can explain the history. I mentioned I did the Rough and Tumble book. Well, Jake Shannon has done a number of books that are great education for the fans on the history of shoot wrestling, catch wrestling. Some may call it hook style wrestling, but really American wrestling. And recently, we've had the pleasure of working with 6 Degrees Media and the what's the Action Martial Arts platform, the Action Martial Arts magazine, and they have a large presence on YouTube and Roku. And with KJ Kordick, who was my broadcast partner when I worked for Waco Kickboxing years ago. And I was having that conversation with KJ just this afternoon about how wrestling is America's original martial art. Catch wrestling is America's original martial art. So we will continue to educate the fans on that. I've provided Jake and our producer Eli with some old interviews that I did with Billy Wicks and Frankie Kane for a DVD I produced many years ago called Tale of Two Carnies. And we'll be able to get the story out there in their own words. Jake has great sit-down interview that he did with Carl Gotch himself. So we have all of that in our library to present to the fans with this contemporary promotion, Shoot Pro Wrestling. So it truly is taking folks back to the future.
So I hope this isn't too much of like a deep dive question, but I want to ask Jake, and also maybe Pat can give his thoughts. But you know, when I was prepping for this conversation, I was thinking about that famous match that Sakuraba had with Gracie, where he won, and at the end he said, "Pro wrestling is the strongest," you know, or "Pro wrestling is strong." Do you think that Shoot Pro Wrestling is trying to carry the torch of that attitude that Sakuraba was expressing when he made that famous comment after the match, "Pro wrestling is strong"? I wanted you to speak to that, Jake. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, so I've not really made it too much of a secret, but Sakuraba was pretty much the inspiration for all the work that I've done since 2002 with regards to scientific wrestling, Shoot Pro Wrestling. I do really feel, you know, he was trained by Billy Robinson. That was a reason why I pursued training with Billy Robinson for the 7 years that I was lucky to learn with him. And yeah, 100%. You know, the spirit of Shoot Pro Wrestling is slightly different. Like it's interesting when you look at the business models. UFC is promoted like boxing. That's because that's where the world Dana White came from, his advisors came from. It's promoted like boxing. And so what you end up having is you have all these matches that are exactly the same rules. It's just different characters come in. But the problem is there's no like stable. You don't like, only a few of the characters do you get to know and relate with. And if they start losing, they're out. But what's different about pro wrestling, and you can look at some of the promotions that are based off of pro wrestling, like Pride, where Sakuraba made his name, or Pancrase, they developed stables of fighters, and you got to know the guys as personalities and their win-loss record. And it was more about the fighting spirit, about the guys getting out there and really putting on, giving 100%. And, you know, Pat could speak to this. There's definitely a difference between fighting to win and fighting not to lose. And I see that fighting not to lose spirit happen a lot, especially in the UFC, guys gaming the system and not really throwing themselves into it. And that's what we want to do, is we want to support this idea that I think the Japanese brought to pro wrestling, and that is fighting spirit, if that makes any sense. I don't know. Maybe Pat could speak to that. Pat, by the way, is the perfect guy to be El Presidente Shoot Pro. It's in his genes. So he mentioned Johnny Myler Miletich. That's a combo man, a guy who could do boxing and catch wrestling. That's proto MMA, man, way, way back. This is why we're real lucky to have Pat.
Well, and along your point with Sakuraba, when he beat Royce Gracie in that Pride tournament, the original Pride Grand Prix, that was the event that I trained Mark Coleman for, and Coleman won that won that tournament. So I was there that night cornering Coleman, and we were in the locker room because in the Tokyo Dome, there was a main locker room on one end of the Tokyo Dome, and then they would load you in a van and they would take you around to the other side of the Tokyo Dome and then put you in a holding locker room before you came out for your fight. And we were in that locker room for, what was it? Well, how long was that fight between Sakuraba and Hoist? It was like an hour and 20 minutes or something crazy, right? So every time I would start warming Coleman up, it would look like Sakuraba was about to finish him, and the round would, end, or Gracie would survive something, and Coleman would storm around the locker room cussing, losing his mind, like, this is ridiculous. I can't believe we have to wait on this asshole. But so anyway, but no, Sakuraba proved without a doubt he did it in style and played a lot of games with Hoist that night. Pulling his gi down around his arms and doing all kinds of gamesmanship. It was beautiful. It was amazing. He actually put a pro wrestling flair into an hour and 20-minute real fight. It was incredible.
And one of my favorite fights, if not my favorite fight of all time, because it was so telling, was when Matt Hughes from Miletich Fighting Systems completely demolished Hoist Gracie and really just exposed as Art said with me many times, the infomercial that was the early UFCs. And when Matt finished Renzo Gracie's student, Ricardo Almeida, he made it a point to say that was a wrestling move that he used, that he put him out with a front headlock in that fight. So, I mean, really the dominance of the Miletich Fighting Systems team was on display there, and the dominance of American wrestling, which is what
you're going to
we're
create,
promoting with Shoot Pro Wrestling.
Yeah, and you're going to create better the Shoot Pro style, the catch as catch can, invariably is going to produce more aggression, better athletes, more explosive athletes, because again, look, a guy who's a real estate executive or a banker can learn jujitsu, become a black belt, and be extremely dangerous on the ground, extremely dangerous. So make no mistake about that. But a catch as catch can guy on the attack with the power, the balance, the submission skills as well, all of those things. I mean, it's a whole different animal generally.
Yeah, definitely. And something else that's so critical here is that when you get guys competing in this, they love it. Pat had us out to South Dakota, El Presidente, for a match, Shoot Pro match on the Fight to Win card. And I recruited a young man from my alma mater through his old coach, Charlie Vlado, Brandon Riggins, and he took on the top South Dakota MMA fighter in his weight class. And Brandon ended up winning in a best of three, in a very exciting best of three, very competitive best of three. And I can tell you that ever since that experience, Brandon's been hitting me up constantly saying, when are you bringing me back? That was so much fun. Because when guys compete under this rule set of pin or submit with the 3 5-minute rounds, the way we have this set up, they absolutely love it. And we're going to be able to bring in more high-level wrestlers into this that may not want to do MMA because it's strictly a grappling promotion. Competitors love it, right, Jake?
Oh yeah, and it's so funny because as we've been talking with Pat too, one of the things that we've tried to explore is, we want to go and throw back to the original, the source, the catch as catch can, and stay true to it. But we also want to innovate. Innovation and doing great things is important. And one of those innovations that we've done is to hold the first ever legitimate tag team pro wrestling matches. Now, what's great is that Pat was
I
already
wanted to ask you about that, by the way, so go on.
yeah. Pat was experimenting with this already in between fights on, like, I think it was amateur MMA matches, if I'm not mistaken. He was messing around with doing tag team matches, but we really said, let's lean into this, all the tropes of pro wrestling, and we've done tournaments, and it's incredible. And the funny thing is, to what Matt was saying to the King of Connecticut, was that when these guys, in particular the tag team, when we would run practice and we'd be doing singles matches and everybody getting used to the rules and all that, everybody loves that. And Matt's right, it does drive the action. It's a fantastic format for grappling, the pinning with the submissions. However, once the athletes started doing the tag team, that's all they wanted to do. They're like, dude, can we just do more tag team? I'm like, no, we need to do all the matches. You're not even booked on a tag team match. It's so much fun because there is this moment, just like in the theatrical pro wrestling, when you tag your opponent, you can have 2-on-1. The tagged guy and the live guy can get in against the other opponent for a quick 5 count. So it turns into a brawl. It's fascinating to watch, but there's so much action in the ring. We learned through actually testing this, there's so much action in the ring, we actually have to have 2 refs. One ref that's inside and one ref that's on the outside to watch all of the action, because there's so many players.
We also have something exciting to announce. We've added a World Jiu-Jitsu champion and WWE Hall of Famer Tito Santana's daughter, Jenny Santana, to our team. And I just did a podcast with her with Crime and Entertainment the other night, and she's going to be hosting a women's grappling tournament in Vegas at Ansiate that we're planning on it being a tribute to the great legendary Mildred Burke, featured in the book and the movie Queen of the Ring. So we're going to have the tag teams, of course, we've already done, and we're going to start doing a women's division as well.
I wanted to ask, since Jake brought it up, that whole idea of fighting spirit, and you said, Jake, that maybe Pat could speak more to that. Pat, would you be able to speak more to that and how that's going to factor in?
Fighting spirit, I would say this, that, the Japanese mentality, I'll just say this, they appreciate the art, they appreciate the effort, they appreciate, the Japanese crowd would be basically silent until someone would go for a submission and the crowd would start to rise a little bit in noise. And then when someone would escape a submission, they really appreciated the craftiness and the ability to escape and get out of, and showing that chess match and that back and forth, the appreciation for that. But that samurai spirit, the mentality of Americans, as you got to understand, when I go to Japan and see the respect and all of this, and then I'd go to an MMA event back in the States, and you'd hear a guy in the crowd going, "Bust his skull cap off," and stuff like that. You'd go, "Holy shit, 2 worlds, totally different." But more than anything, when you take the aggressiveness of a wrestler combined and add the submissions, you're going to have just a different level, and you're going to see just a different level of action. Amazing scrambles, people scrambling to get off their back so they don't get pinned, and at the same time trying to stay out of submissions. And that takes massive amounts of effort. I can't lay on my back and coast and just be really good at letting somebody wear themselves out in the guard. So there's so many angles to that fighting spirit mentality. I could take it back to, I grew up in Bettendorf, Iowa, the Quad Cities. It's a river town. It's blue collar. It's farmer. It's work ethic. It's fighting for your next meal. Back to my great uncle, Johnny Miletich, who, when he was boxing when he started out in amateur boxing, when the Ford Motor plant closed during the Depression, you got to understand, everybody was freaking starving. Those guys were fighting for foods, like literally certificates to get groceries. So there's a lot of ways that I look at that fighting spirit, right?
I just had two more questions I wanted to ask you guys, if we can go maybe a few minutes over, if that's okay. The first one is, and Jake, you may be great for this, is, Shoot Pro Wrestling is described on your website as the first competitive professional wrestling promotion with a rule set co-developed by Karl Gotch himself. If people aren't in the know, what does that all entail? Maybe you can talk a little bit about Karl Gotch and what that rule set is and why you promote that so heavily on the website.
Well, really, I do bring a lot of kind of wrestling nerd to the product, and I feel it's important. I think history is super important. I feel science and technology. I think all these things are actually super crucial, but they're kind of a lot of times behind the scenes. And so, with regards to the historical side, when you look at a guy like Karl Gotch, who people may not know who that is, Karl Gotch was an Olympian. He was in the 1948 Olympics in London, was a Belgian freestyle and Greco-Roman champion. He got recruited when they saw him wrestling in London. The Wiganers, actually was Billy Robinson's uncle Alf, was scouting on behalf of Billy Riley's gym, saw Karl, invited him to come back to Wigan. Karl was a heavyweight. He was a big, strong human being, very nimble, could do like the iron rings. He could do all the crazy gymnastics. He could do all that stuff. A stud. He went to Wigan and got schooled by middleweights. And he realized, I have to stay here. He stayed in Wigan for 12 years until he felt like he'd reached he learned everything he possibly could there. Then he went to the States where he learned he got hooked up in Ohio with a promoter named Al Haft. Al Haft was a professional wrestler earlier, and he went by the name Young Gotch in reference to Frank Gotch of Iowa fame, and probably the most famous catch wrestler, most successful catch wrestler by many measures. Well, in homage to Al Haft, Karl took on the name in the ring, Karl Gotch. His real name was Stas. He was Hungarian. And while he was in Ohio, he hooked up, and this is something that Frankie Kane, who's a mutual friend of both Matt and I, was able to let me know, and I brought it up with Karl. And this guy's in America named Frank Wolf, who also trained a little bit of Frankie Kane, taught Karl a bunch of American-style catch wrestling, which is sort of controversial in the little catch wrestling world, that Karl actually considered himself an American wrestler after learning from Frank Wolf, saying the American style was superior to the Wigan style, but that's neither here nor there. Karl then tried to fit into pro wrestling, but because of the corrupt nature of it, and he knew he could kick everybody's ass, he got blacklisted. He got in a fist fight with the first Nature Boy, Buddy Rogers, who was a big name. Yeah, big name. He was the Hulk Hogan of the time, the Ric Flair of the time, and Karl wasn't having it. He beat the shit out of him. Well, he got blacklisted, and the only place he could go, his friend Big Bill Miller, was in Japan wrestling. And he said, Karl, you got to come out here. They'd actually appreciate you. And they did. This is where he got to be known as the God of wrestling. And he hooked up with a famous pro wrestler named Antonio Inoki, who is famous for doing one of the biggest early MMA matches against Muhammad Ali. And in Japan, Karl went on to influence because it's such a combat culture. It is fighting spirit there. Like the United States, yeah, the greatest wrestlers are here, but also it's a big ball sport like basketball, baseball, football. In Japan, it's all combat sports. Karl, that like Matt was alluding to, was responsible he cornered Inoki in that fight against Ali. He started Shuto. He inspired Shuto with Tiger Mask, a pro wrestler who was a student of his. He inspired Pancras. So Karl Gotch really and inspired the UWF and the UWFI, which later became Pancras. Later became Pride Fighting Championships. All of that came from Karl Gotch. Had he been hit by a bus, well, he was actually in in a Nazi concentration camp during World War II, prior to winning the Olympics, had he died in that concentration camp, which he nearly did from starvation, it's a very likely scenario that MMA may not exist. So I consider, from kind of a historical standpoint, when you look at the actual history and not the marketing that Matt was alluding to with Art Davie, the founder of the UFC, like the marketing, but looking at the actual history, Karl Gotch is the father of MMA. And so for us to have a guy like that, he was a very good, close friend of mine and mentor, to help me devise rules for modern catch wrestling matches was priceless. Nobody will ever. I've inspired a lot of my own competitors, which is what a leader does. You know, people like what you're doing and they want to do their own thing because they don't like you, or they want to do their own thing and get the glory, whatever. They'll never be able to say, I mean, everything is derivative out of Karl. And so to me, that's a huge feather in the cap of Shoot Pro.
Real briefly, Jake, in that regard, what is the rule set basically?
Well, I mean, it's a fundamentally longer time periods. So we have matches that can be, it's best of 3 falls, right? So none of this like, oh, he won and we have to build up for a whole program to do the crap they do in boxing. We figured out right now who's the best man on that night. The second of all, it's pin or submission. And we have the most liberal or open, the most free rule set. And that is that pretty much anything goes, except small joint manipulation, eye pokes, groin shots. But it's very, very, very open. It's similar how MMA has an open policy on most submissions. So, but the real innovation, and it seems like a no-brainer to me, is really the pin. Like, everybody sleeps on the pin, and they're like, "Oh, just take the pin out." And like, no, it's actually it's the secret to the sauce. It's the Colonel's secret recipe. It's really what makes it amazing, in my opinion.
I just had one more question for Pat, and maybe Jake, you can comment on this too. I think sometimes when I talk to people outside of the combat sports world, I'll use the term, well, catch wrestling, combat sports, these are all sort of sciences. I mean, they call boxing the sweet science, and there's a reason for that. And I think sometimes people have a hard time understanding. There is sort of a set of principles that you have to follow, a sort of systemic study of principles involving grappling, leverage, biomechanics that you all use to achieve techniques and strategies to win. So there are these sort of scientific principles at play to understand and improve performance. And I think, Pat, that ties into having something like the Miletich fighting system. Can you speak to catch wrestling as a sort of science? There is a sort of science to it.
Oh no, there's a massive amount of science, and the thing is the beauty of even collegiate wrestling, D1 guys, the level of finesse and technique, and then you combine that with, again, supreme levels of power, explosiveness, athleticism, all of those things. But
Even
catch as
strategy
catch
as well.
can. Yeah, and there's so much, what's up my sleeve, just as there is in any combat art or warfare in general, but then it's mano a mano, that, yeah, there's a lot of deception, a lot of stuff that I'm doing that is sending a mixed signal, maybe making the guy defend his neck when I really want his arm or something else. All of those things are going on. And maybe, just maybe, I'm scaring the daylights out of him with a choke while actually I'm trying to pin him. So there's that extra added element of getting pinned along with being submitted. That's that dual threat that I can at any point attack one or the other or both at the same time to expose and scare the daylights out of my opponent and get him to fall for one of them, right? So there's that added element.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because like one of the things that I've had the pleasure of being in the room when Pat coaches, and one of the things that he talks about are these some of the most basic scientific principles of like How do you get leverage-based compliance out of another human being that is non-compliant, right? Like, this is the difference between theatrical wrestling and shoot wrestling is compliance. How do I put on a show with another human being that is trying to do to me what I'm doing to them? That is so fundamental to the human experience. I don't think we'll ever transcend it. Pat is an expert at the science of all this. You know, he says it himself. He's like, I make superhumans. Look at what he was able to do, not just with himself, but with his entire team. I mean, Pat is one of the winningest, if not winningest, MMA coaches out there. And a lot of the coaches don't have the wins that he's actually been able to do for himself as well. That got him in the UFC Hall of Fame. So we're very blessed to have this amazing team. I'm so excited for the future. You know, the main thing is that we're looking for that big level support, right? We're looking for our version of the Fertitas, our version of Ari Emanuel, our guy who gets the vision, sees the vision, and wants to run with it, and understands that while it's complementary in some ways, sits between WWE and UFC, it's its own thing, and it has hundreds of years of tradition and so many wonderful characters in history. I'm so excited about the future, honestly, for Shoot Pro Wrestling.
Definitely. And one quick thing I wanted to add in the discussion, Jake was saying about the history, and you asked, the host JG asked about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Well, let's look at Helio Gracie, right, who was the grandfather of the Brazilian Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. Who did he compete against? I'll give you one. The name Kimura is often used for a double wrist lock. Why do they call it a Kimura? Well, they call it a Kimura because Japanese professional wrestler Masahiko Kimura broke Helio Gracie's arm with that hold when they competed. Who else did Helio Gracie compete against? He competed against professional wrestler, catch wrestler, Wladek Zabisco, who absolutely ragdolled him. And he competed against professional wrestler, catch wrestler, who is even considered more of a showman than a shooter, Fred Ebert, who took him to a draw. So the roots, again, of every form of, be it MMA, be it Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, be it modern day grappling, be it NCAA wrestling, the roots of every single one of those is catch wrestling and is shoot pro wrestling. And that's why, as fans, you need to check out shootprowrestling.com.
Well, I want to thank all three of you for coming on Parallax Views, and I should have mentioned this earlier, to be honest. It's my fault. You've already been releasing some of the matches today, actually, on YouTube. So how can my listeners keep up with everything? Jake, lead us out.
Yeah, so if you're interested, we have our first full produced episode. It's available for viewing. King mentioned Brandon Riggins and Blade Auk. That was held in North Dakota.
South Dakota.
Excuse me. Was it
North
North
Dakota.
or North?
North Dakota.
North Dakota. At the Skydancer. And very special thank you to Pat's girlfriend and promoter for helping us make that happen. But that whole episode is available up at shootprowrestling.com. But what we've decided to do, we actually have an open-ended contract with Triller, and we have other people interested in distributing it. But what we found out when we did the research, YouTube is where it's at. So we're taking the highly produced content, and anybody who goes to the Scientific Wrestling YouTube channel, we're actually creating a Shoot Pro channel, and we're going to be posting all of the matches with commentary. Pat was a special guest referee for the cage match that we had. So we're doing all the different tropes of pro wrestling in a legit competitive environment. But again, check out the Scientific Wrestling YouTube. And also check out the Shoot Pro Wrestling page. We are constantly updating it. We're adding new matches. We actually have a full season of TV that we're producing right now as well. So I think probably YouTube's the best place.
I want to give a shout out to our media partners that are airing Shoot Pro Wrestling, Crime and Entertainment, which is a very popular podcast platform, Canada's top combat sports podcast with over 500,000 subscribers, the Hannibal TV, and Action Martial Arts and the 6 Degrees Media on both their YouTube and their Roku platforms. And one other I forgot, I don't want to forget the Paz, great wrestler and grappler himself, is airing us on the ever popular 2-man power trip of wrestling, which Pat and I had the pleasure of being a guest on.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. I want to thank you again, Jake, Pat, and Matt for coming on Parallax Views, and I hope people check out Shoot Pro Wrestling.
Thanks, JG.
Thank you.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. As always, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with JG Views. To Parallax Views with JG Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.